Hi, and welcome to Ones and Twos, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple of data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we will be talking about this year's Nobel Prize winners for economics. That's become something of a tradition on this podcast. We like to talk about the winners every year. It's been 3 years that we've been doing that, so we'll continue the trend. But in the first half of the show, we have another data point. That is 7.5 trillion, as in 7.5 trillion won. That is the total size of stimulus measures that have been put into effect this year in China. That is equivalent to about $1.07 trillion, or 6% of China's GDP.
It will issue more government debt to revive the country's stalling economy. At a press conference on Saturday, China's finance ministry says it plans to offer subsidies to people with low incomes, support the property market, and replenish state banks' capital.
Last month, the Chinese government announced a raft of stimulus measures to try and reboot the domestic economy, having spent the last few years stubbornly refusing to do so.
The markets are fixating on what will come out of China. Now, the last time markets fixated on China, they got disappointed, big time, right? I mean, out of those holidays in China.
All that is designed to respond to China's economic troubles right now, with growth below expectations, all hampered by an ailing real estate market and high youth unemployment, problems we've discussed here before. The stimulus now comes in a variety of forms. China's central bank is involved with hundreds of billions of dollars of facilities of various kinds. Bonds are being issued to help local governments and consumers. State-owned banks are being provided with capital, et cetera, et cetera. But the response in financial markets hasn't yet been hugely enthusiastic, and that may be because it's not exactly clear what the stimulus is intended to accomplish exactly. So, yeah, we thought we'd try to answer that and figure out what's going on. But first, Adam, according to some reports, this is the largest stimulus of any kind in history, at least in nominal terms, is the phrase I came across. And I'm curious, is that true? And in a more general sense, I mean, I guess, how does one go about measuring the sizes of stimulus in the first place?
I'm puzzled by this claim because the estimates, well, first of all, we don't actually yet have a fixed figure for the stimulus, and it's a matter that's going to be sorted out over the coming weeks. And people have criticized the Chinese government for not offering a clearer number. The sort of estimates that you see by analysts like Deutsche Bank, for instance, which put together the different elements, come to about 7.5 trillion yuan. So that's just over $1 trillion, which is not the biggest stimulus because the 2021 Biden stimulus would be 80% bigger than that, like at 1.8, 1.9 trillion. As a share of GDP, also, currently that would be 6%. That's a big hit. But if you look at some of the COVID era pushes, they're in that kind of ballpark. I mean, for heaven's sake, the US is currently running a fiscal deficit of 7%, just as a kind of routine thing. So it's big, but I think when they say it's the biggest, I think what they're talking about is that it's the largest in Chinese history in absolute terms, because it's larger than I think this would the argument, it would be up there as, you know, in both scale and in proportional terms with the stimuli of 2015 and 2008. So what this constitutes is a recognition by the Chinese leadership that something serious is going on, that the period of denial has to be over, that they need to do something. And they're pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into mortgage debt service support for the stock market, to assist local government spending and help consumers. It's a pretty broadband package, but we don't really yet have the precise numbers, and the absolute scale is not yet final.
Yeah, so I guess to return to that question I raised just a bit ago, I mean, is it possible to say what the exact goal in economic terms of this stimulus is if we sort of take all the measures together? I mean, there's a lot of talk about how China's economy needs or could benefit from some kind of structural shift, a shift towards more domestic demand, less reliance on investment and exports. Is that what's going on in this stimulus at all? A move in that direction, sort of an attempt to change those structural conditions of the Chinese economy? Or is it really just a matter of kind of boost growth in a very sort of short-term way? Or alternatively, is it kind of to make Chinese markets and financial markets seem more attractive, kind of trying to goose markets in a way and maybe kind of get some positive feedback loop with a kind of wealth effect that I've read about elsewhere as well?
I mean, I think first and foremost, this is political, actually. It's the sense that the leadership needs to regain the initiative, regain leadership on this issue, stop the sense of drift, and respond to the pervasive sense of crisis, of which the fluctuations and the parlous state of the stock market was one rather vivid indicator. In the background, then, of course, there's the real estate crisis looming in the background. On the one hand, the short-term problem of youth unemployment, and in the long run, issues of demography and so on. And I think above all, this is an effort on the part of Beijing to signal, first of all, to the party leadership itself across the vast expanse of China, and then to the rest of the Chinese population that Beijing understands. Because the pervasive sense I had when I was there in the summer was the question that was being asked is, does Beijing really get it? And the answer for this measure, there was an unscheduled meeting chaired by Xi on the economy, and now this package. And the phraseology that's being used is very telling. They've picked up a key phrase from the Deng Xiaoping era, which was bold and steady. And the combination of both being bold and fearless, those are language that's being used. And on the other hand, staying the course and riding this out without making catastrophic mistakes, another buzzword for the regime. That, I think, is the key issue here. And first and foremost, a signal like this from Beijing acts as a kind of what they call a campaign rally. So it's a slogan around which then across China's huge expanse in provincial governments and at the city level, initiatives will then be launched under the slogan that we need bold and steady action to allow the Chinese economy to recover. So that's what this is about, right? You can think of China as a conventional macroeconomy where it's a matter of confidence and markets and expectations and animal spirits and all of those things. And there are elements of the Chinese economy which follow that kind of Western logic of market and economic psychology. But in the Chinese case, because of the power of the party, it's more like a locker room talk for the team at halftime, where the coach sits everyone down and says, we can still win this, and this is we're going to go out in the second half and we're going to play, this is going to be our strategy and we're going to pull ourselves together. And that I think is the key function. Of course, macroeconomically, it will then depend on how much money is actually available. But if you ask what the main signal to be sent is, it's this. We're in control. We're in charge. Yes, we can fix this. There hasn't been a problem we haven't overcome before. We can go back to the great era of, hardship, but also reform of the 1980s and carry this through following the wise principles of previous eras of leadership. Not something necessarily the Xi Jinping team always paying their respects to, but in this case, that seems to be the direction they've gone in.
Okay, so if the goals here are political, I guess for me that raises the question of how the crisis management political goal that you're talking about relates to the other political economic goals that the Chinese government has and has articulated. Xi Jinping has described a longer-term vision he has for the Chinese economy, one described as, quote, high-quality development. And the emphasis there seems to be on developing technology, on China becoming a leading innovator and producer of technology. And I'm curious how this stimulus relates to that long-term goal. I mean, much of the stimulus seems focused on making it easier in various ways for financial institutions to lend money and for people in China to borrow money, perhaps. But is a lack of kind of available finance, really what is preventing that domestic vision that she described from being realized, from those investments that would lead to technological development being made in China?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. Let me try a medical analogy as a way of trying to think about the relationships here. I think of the high quality development program, high quality productive forces program, as a kind of long-term health program, right? It's a get fit program. It's entering a new game. It's learning new physical skills. It's that kind of a problem. At the other end of the spectrum, of economic crisis management, there is what you might think of as a heart attack problem, right? Which is, say, the financial crisis of 2008. Both of these will involve medical advice, but they involve very different types of medical advice. And China isn't having a financial heart attack right now. So it doesn't need the kind of paddles on whatever it takes monetary policy stimulus that, say, the US needed in 2008 or in 2020 when the Treasury market was going crazy. The focus of the current crisis management methods, I don't think, is on either the long-run Get Fit program or paddles on to save, to restore heart function. It's in between, and it's somewhere between a nasty but curable cancer diagnosis and a nasty bout of pneumonia. If you think of the real estate problem, I think that's in the kind of cancer bucket, in that it's a fixable problem because we've caught it early enough, but it's going to require some serious surgical intervention and some pretty painful treatments in the meantime. And we're going to have to do some restructuring. We're literally going to maybe have to do surgical intervention. The immediate need for the action right here, right now, these weeks, is that we've also been diagnosed with pneumonia, and the way that pneumonia runs, if it gets at you quickly, it can kill you in a matter of days. And so we need to take action quickly. It's not a heart attack where you're going to die in minutes. It's not cancer where you'll die in months. It's not long-run health where it's a matter of years. It's in this space in between where if the Chinese economy heads into a deflationary spiral, there may be no getting it back, or rather it may settle at a really low level of function and may suffer permanent lung damage that we need to avoid by acting now. And the reason to act is not that the heart stopped, but that we have this aggressive lack of confidence malaise that is taking hold of the overall circulatory cardiovascular system of the economy. I hope, maybe this analogy is helpful. Now, unlike, cancer, pneumonia, fitness, and a heart attack, in the economy, all of these things fit into each other. But I think conceptually and in terms of political urgencies, we're in the pneumonia space, not the heart attack space. And there isn't even very much in this package that's addressing the cancer problem. There's not that much addressing the real estate crisis, because that requires a comprehensive restructuring of balance sheets. There's an awful lot of debt that's got to be shuffled off weak hands onto stronger hands and then probably be written down. Those are actions that need to be unfolded urgently, but not with the same kind of urgency that you need to apply when somebody's respiratory system is slow, failing over a period of days and weeks because they've got pneumonia. So that is where I would see this program as being fast acting now to avoid dying of this before we even get to addressing the other issues.
Got it. I mean, maybe then just to follow up on that analogy, I mean, it sounds like then they're not treating this pneumonia medium-term problem as an opportunity to address the longer term.
No, this I really think doesn't have that flavor. I mean, I heard the Prime Minister at the Chinese Davos speaking, earlier in the year, and I mean, he was very clear that this is very different from what he was talking about. He was insisting on the absolute priority of the long term above all else. They were just going to focus on doing a series of supply side measures. They weren't going to succumb to the Western demand for immediate action. They don't have a Western style banking crisis, so it's important to emphasize that. But clearly they've recognized they need to do something stimulus wise to help. One should add in, of course, that they are facing the not death sentence, but they are facing the serious risk that Trump will be elected and impose some sweeping and draconian set of tariffs against Chinese exports. And so they know they have to keep something in the locker because who knows, they may need to do a large bailout of their export sector.
I mean, in general, it does seem to me like the responses are really concentrated on the sort of supply side of the Chinese economy in terms of, again, making more finance available for various existing actors in the economy, but not subsidizing consumption or demand, which again is a kind of longer term structural issue that a lot of economists have pointed to that needs to be addressed in China. And that got me wondering, even the failure to use this crisis to address that issue got me wondering whether there's a tension in communist ideology itself in addressing this issue. I mean, is there a tension in communist ideology when it comes to subsidizing consumption? I mean, is communism then ultimately more consistently about production, productivism, I guess you could say, versus something we call welfarism, basically providing for the well-being of consumers and citizens in that way? I mean, is communism ultimately more concerned with the supply side than demand side? Is that what's going on here in China in some way?
Yeah, I think there are different levels. It's very fascinating what we've seen exposed, because there's this sort of hardcore kind of aspect to the CCP and its public-facing ideology that's, a million miles away removed from the discourse of Western politics. I mean, there are these two phrases, which I'm going to try and say in Chinese because I'm learning Chinese and I'm very excited that I actually can try and pronounce them. But one of them is called gnawing on the hard bones. They both have to do with eating. So that's ken ying gu tao. So that means, gnawing on the hard bones. And then the other famous phrase that Xi Jinping has also used is cheku, so to eat bitterness, right? So there is a kind of embrace of toughness. There's an embrace of, the fighting spirit, and we can do this, which is quite different from Western politics, right? But I think, we need to temper this a little bit by just some sort of historical perspective. I'd actually think it would be great to do maybe even a series of episodes on Chinese lifestyles and the welfare system is a big part of that, because it would be kind of crazy, especially sitting in a city like New York, to somehow give lectures to China about welfarism, right? In the sense that this is obviously the greatest project of poverty alleviation in human history. And you can go a very long way in the big cities of China without seeing the kind of manifest poverty and deprivation that you see on every corner of New York City right now, right? You just don't see it. So at some basic level, we should be tempering this. But what is clear is, I think, three things. The first is that China went through a wrenching shift in its welfare model. And previously it had a welfare model, but as your question was sort of suggesting, it was very tightly linked to production. In other words, all the benefits, housing, pensions, were all provided by the firm, the productive units that workers were attached to, whether in the countryside or whether in the city. And that model was broken in the 1990s, quite deliberately disassembled because it seemed highly inefficient and encumbered the productive units. And that, I think, sets up this current perception of China as, all production, no welfare. It's not fair to the Chinese regime, and it's also kind of an implausible model of how China functions, because they recognize that stripping away the iron rice bowl, which was the welfare system that attached workers to their productive units, they had to provide some alternative, and they did in the form of nationally organized but regionally funded and provided basic institutions of social insurance, of publicly subsidized health insurance, a pension system, and then the system called Dibao, which is the minimum means-tested minimum provision, which provides the poorest Chinese, roughly 6 to 7% of the population, with a minimal income. It started in Shanghai, but that's, as it were, the basic safety net of welfare. So they made this shift from a production unit centered to a, in a sense, more Western style, nationally organized but regionally managed welfare system. And the thing about that is spending levels on it are indeed very modest by OECD standards, very modest by rich country standards. They're more comparable to what you see in similar emerging markets. Say Mexico, for instance, is on a similar level. Levels of spending and levels of organization are much higher than they are in India, which obviously also has a much lower GDP per capita. So China, in this respect, is a highly organized but fairly frugal emerging market economy. And the third thing that's really fascinating, supported both by anecdotal evidence of knowing Chinese people and opinion polling, is that the Chinese population itself, this isn't just a CCP thing, but the Chinese population itself, which of course lives in a world of CCP memes, but also is itself a profoundly dynamic and autonomous cultural sphere, is highly skeptical with regard to laziness, welfarism. This isn't just, as it were, an ideology from above that's punitively imposed on Chinese, but something that's owned by Chinese society, which is a society which likes messages like eat bitterness, right? This is part of the culture of high performance in education and so on. So there is indeed a kind of tough nut trap that China is in a certain sense. Also reinforced by a highly inegalitarian tax system, because basically lower income Chinese pay more tax than people in the middle. It's only until you get to the very top of the income tax range, and most Chinese don't pay any income tax, that you have progressivity kicking in. So altogether, it's a very strange social bargain. And looked at from a macroeconomic point of view, it just doesn't give enough juice to Chinese consumer demand, right? So this meme, this idea of China as being a really anti-welfarist system is very much driven not by the reality of poverty alleviation or the reality of street life in China, where actual poverty is much less manifest than it is in New York, for instance, but driven essentially by a set of kind of macroeconomic policy puzzles where outside analysts go, well, why aren't you juicing consumer demand? And then you get this perspective which says, well, that would require structural reform to the welfare system, and there's a whole series of concerns about that. So I think that's, it's both a valid observation about China, but also rather simplifying as to how welfare actually functions. And this gets into the nitty-gritty. There was quite a firestorm recently about a set of papers and analyses about how on-the-job food, for instance, and canteens are provided in many Chinese work settings, which are essentially they're not food stamps programs, but they are a form of subsidy to employees, which is quite considerable and not often measured in these welfare numbers. So very complicated picture, as you'd expect, and one I think we should come back to.
Agreed. For now, we should probably take a break, though, and then come back to talk about the Nobel Prize winners in economics. So, yeah, stick with us. Hi, welcome back. Our next data point is 1500. That is 1500 as in the year 1500 AD. That's a year that plays a central role in the theory of colonial economic development developed by Daron Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson, the economists who won this year's Nobel Prize in economics. These three economists are frequent collaborators, and they were celebrated for their answer to an age-old question of why some countries are richer than others. And they offer basically a break with geographic determinism, focusing instead on the role that institutions play in setting the groundwork for prosperity. Specifically, they highlight inclusive institutions, which privilege cooperation, mutual well-being, as opposed to extractive institutions, which privilege the interests of elites. And there's also a historic claim here, to get back to that year 1500, namely that differences in prosperity today can be traced back to the types of institutions that colonial powers set up in their colonies in the 16th century. So thought we'd try to unpack some of these ideas, Adam, as we've done in the past with Nobel Prize winners. So to start off, I'm curious about the new analytical pathways that these three, they're sometimes referred to as AJR. I find that useful just because Acemoglu, Johnson, Robinson, none of them was terribly hard, but yeah, we can maybe use the AJR acronym if we want. I'm curious, what pathways their emphasis on institutions opened up, because, what existed before they did this work? I mean, were development economists not taking the economic effects of institutions seriously before? I mean, what were they then doing instead prior to this work?
Well, I mean, development economics for a long time, functioned more in the manner of sort of dynamic macroeconomics. It was about raising investment, driving technological change. So it just simply was standard growth economics, but in poor countries. That's an incredibly crude simplification. If you wanted to say that institutional economics added a really new dimension, you would say, and then what institutional economics did was to ask more fundamental questions about what motivated accumulation in the first place, what the structures were within which accumulation can take place. And AGR would never claim that they originated this field. I mean, there was the first generation of institutional economics, which would be the folks of the mid-20th century, the 30s, the 40s, that already developed an understanding, if you like, of business institutions as, for instance, or markets as endogenous, right? There aren't just markets and businesses. You have to ask the question, why is exchange and production organized through markets rather than through business forms or political structures? These are the sorts of questions, of course, that 19th century social theory, in the form of Karl Marx, for instance, or 18th century social theory had also tried to answer. That was the first generation of institutional economics. The second generation that AGR are immediately responding to are people like Douglas North, who himself won the Nobel Prize in 1993. So I would think of this as the second prize given to the institutional school. And the distinctive contribution of the AGR, that piece, which, if you read the scientific so-called justification for the economics Nobel, they focus very heavily on this piece of work that AGR did on the issue of not just that why some countries are rich now and some not, but also the strange inversion of the world after 1500 and the paradoxical. The paradoxical thing that AGR were trying to make sense of is the fact that societies that were relatively rich in 1500 found themselves lower down the pecking order later on. So there's an inversion. And furthermore, these kind of inversions are not common in the historical record prior to the Western discovery of the world, of Western expansion. And their theory is essentially that, if Western colonists in the right environmental settings, the environmental settings do matter, but if in the right environmental settings, Western colonists encounter already rich societies, the sort of institutions they tend to put in place are extractive because there's resource to extract. Whereas when they encounter societies which are relatively poor, but maybe resource abundant potentially, they settle themselves down to the hard labor of genocide on the one hand, which is rather underplayed in these accounts, but institution building. And so, it's the standard contrast between the North American colonies settled by hardy Puritan settlers from the Netherlands and Britain, and the plundering conquest, the conquistadors in South America and Latin America, which encountered hugely sophisticated Mesoamerican and Latin American cultures and basically pillaged them. And that is the kind of fundamental contrast that they build their work on. They go on then to elucidate a variety of other cases. People who've read Why Nations Fail will know that they're deeply steeped in 17th century European history, and particularly the history of the British case, so Britain and the 1688 Glorious Revolution. And in the institutionalist tradition, North and Weingast famously produced a set of papers analysing how parliamentary government solved basic problems of commitment. We've talked about this before, the problem of original sin and the way in which an unfettered sovereign has a huge problem making commitments. And so a constrained constitutional sovereign is actually more capable of resource mobilization. And the AJR program is significant because it elucidates in a more general sense the conditions under which those kind of positive sum bargains are possible. How much influence it has on policy is, I think, an open question. Arguably, North and Weingast, who've worked very closely with the World Bank, are in some ways even closer to policy than these folks are. Politically, it's very ambivalent because, on the one hand, in the macro sense, it is a fairly unabashed retelling of Western triumph and Western triumphalism, but in an intelligent manner, avoiding various types of essentialism, but with the same ultimate conclusions. And on the other hand, in the nitty-gritty, often they're quite brave in their criticism of crony capitalism in the West, for instance, in a sense because they are warning against the tendency of Western societies to slide into the kind of extractive resource arrangements that are in the end so disastrous for economic growth. So it's a celebration at the bigger picture. It's an avoidance of essentialism. And in the day-to-day, it can often be, Johnson in particular has been quite vigorous in his criticism, but Acemoglu and Robinson as well, of cronyism in the United States, for instance.
Yeah, the basic idea, I think, does seem really intuitive and plausible that institutions constrain economic activity in various ways, and to the extent that economics kind of became alienated from that idea, it certainly does seem useful to have brought it back and emphasized it and given texture to it. When I was reading through their ideas, one thing that came to mind for me was that this distinction that they draw between inclusive versus extractive institutions. Again, perfectly plausible and intuitive, but I wondered whether that's specific enough. I mean, political science and other disciplines have spent a lot of time thinking about institutions, and I'm curious whether you think AJR account enough for the differences between different kinds of institutions. On one hand, there's like the administrative state. On the other, there's the rule of law. That's a different kind of institution. There's electoral institutions. Democratic elections are a kind of institution. It seems to me that all those can kind of play variable roles when it comes to thinking about their economic effects. And just to take democracy, for example, I mean, is democracy even necessarily useful from an economic perspective at low levels of development? I thought there might be research that suggests otherwise.
I mean, I think AGR are vague, and they are deliberately vague. And this goes back to my reading of their political position, because they know perfectly well that this kind of institutional manner of writing, world history has all of the connotations of Western-centric triumphalism about it. And they are working really quite hard to avoid that. That's, one of their projects. And that means that they don't want to seem excessively culturally deterministic or excessively prescriptive in political terms. And that's at the price then of a certain element of precision, right? They focus on inclusion and extraction so as to get functionally at what institutions need to deliver without necessarily in any very analytically rigorous way spelling out what particular configuration of institutions might be necessary to deliver those outcomes, right? You see what I mean? They're sort of hedging a little bit. I mean, it's a little bit like Jared Diamond's effort to avoid the really grosser forms of Western-centric narrative, right? The argument here is a little bit, it's not, after all, the book is called Why Nations Fail. So, they're not trying to explain fractional differences in growth rates. They're trying to explain big differences in outcomes over a long period of time. So if societies, through a variety of different political forms, can arrange a certain sort of inclusiveness, then anything that provides that outcome is good to go. But it is at some level very unsatisfactory, and they end up smuggling an awful lot of essentially Western-centric baggage in through the back door, because it turns out in detail then, as you say, it's just underspecified. And in the end, some sort of Western-style democracy with freedom of speech turns out to be the only thing that will actually do the job in their own terms. There's a very interesting alternative which is provided within the institutional tradition by Douglas North and his more recent collaborators, so John Joseph Wallace, and Weingast. That's Barry Weingast, who he's been working with for many years now. And they've got this great book called Violence and Social Orders. And that goes rather nicely to your point, Cam, about perhaps some sort of stage theory, because the North, Hollis and Weingast program has this distinction between closed and open orders, which isn't entirely the same as inclusive and extractive, and for good reason. Because they argue that the fundamental problem that has to be solved in human political and social organization is the problem of violence. And without solving that, you can't get anywhere. And they argue that closed social and political caste-like, aristocratically organized, extractive regimes may be inefficient, but they are efficient from the point of view about managing violence. And so in the first instance, the truly poor societies in the world are failing because they haven't solved the problem of violence. And translating violence into systematic extraction is really the first step. And what this enables them to say is that in certain settings, as you were suggesting, the rapid introduction of hubristic efforts in terms of this model at truly inclusive models fail, and they fail systematically because the underlying problem of violence hasn't been resolved. So within the institutionalist paradigm, there are in fact a variety of different positions that are open, and the range of different options in part derives from the fact, Cam, that there's a sense in which the underlying mechanics of what inclusion and extraction, openness and closedness are doing are not as precisely spelled out as in the AGR agenda as they are, for instance, in the stuff that Douglas North has pursued over many years. Had pursued. I mean, he's passed, but was pursuing.
I'm curious if we could, then get even more specific. The biggest development story of any of our lifetimes, obviously, is China's remarkable rise. And I'm curious how and whether AJR's theories can adequately explain that rise, in any way.
Short answer is no. and that's kind of devastating. There was rather a good takedown on Bloomberg where somebody pointed out that, in a sense, this is another one of those retrospective Nobels, because they're honoring a body of thought which, answered a question that around 2000 was very much on people's minds. First phase of the, new era of globalization, what's going on, who's on the top and who's on the bottom. And at this point, we know the answer, right? There was a regime that delivered growth on an absolutely spectacular scale, and it simply doesn't, in any simple sense, conform to their model. Of course, you can fit it in their model in the end by simply saying that the CCP regime offers a viable blend of extraction and inclusion that in the end enables China to grow as rapidly as it has. But, and this is the kicker, given time, it won't work. And in given time, you would expect China to slow down and to succumb to the problems of societies with large, they would insist, extractive sectors centered on the party and the elites clustered around the party. Acemoglu and Robinson have not been shy about pushing this agenda publicly to its logical conclusion. In fact, on Project Syndicate, the op-ed site, they published a really rather aggressive op-ed after what many people thought was Nancy Pelosi's disastrous visit to Taiwan, in which they said, oh, no, people shouldn't get on Pelosi's back, because anyone who does is basically buying into the idea that, democracy isn't for Asian people and specifically isn't for Confucian Chinese culture. And hey, look, Taiwan is demonstrating that, in fact, people who are coming from the Confucian cultural sphere can be democratic, and so we shouldn't be foreclosing this option, as though anyone actually was opposing her visit on those grounds. So it's entirely specious. But they really got out on front on this and insisted, oh, no, our theory is terribly relevant here. And, so they, by way of Taiwan, want to hold open the possibility that really their theory will ultimately bite on China as well. And rather extraordinarily, several Chinese economists, in the wake of the announcement that they had won the Nobel Prize, actually got out on the limb and said, and this has implications for the conversation in China at this particular moment. The stimulus program in China that's ongoing and the efforts of the regime to boost the private sector cannot succeed unless we establish, as these Nobel Prize winning economists show, secure private property rights in China, as though that was actually China's principal problem at this current moment. So it really is. It touches on the Chinese problem and is being played for all it's worth politically.
Interesting. Yeah. At the same time, it does seem to me that AJR, that they are aware of, some of the weaknesses of the kind of simple forms of this theory that they've offered. And, in their more recent work, they're trying to, account for what determines the rise and the persistence of institutions in the first place. And it seems there's some acknowledgement, that it's not only economic factors that can explain these institutions. And yeah, most recently they've turned to questions of culture and basically trying to analyze the role that culture plays in how these institutions get formed and codified. And I'm curious, what you think the economic implications of this turn to culture is. To me, it seemed like it was curious because it seems like it's almost not an economic analysis at all, or it almost seems like it's an acknowledgement that culture supersedes economics and all the kind of economic ideas we're just talking about. That sort of there is a kind of layer of cultural factors that economics can't account for, and that maybe ultimately is an acknowledgement that economists should be ceding territory to perhaps historians like you, Adam, and other social scientists. But what do you make of this kind of analysis of culture that they've most recently turned to?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to be really clear about where culture fits in their analysis. So, one thing they're arguing with is geography, and they're resisting geographic determinism. But they quite explicitly, it's not that they don't do culture or shy about it, they disapprove of simplistic cultural explanations, because to their mind, they live in their own sort of Punch and Judy show of this. But in their world, cultural explanations are deterministic and crude and ethno-racial stereotyping, essentially. Their original program was to resist explanations in those terms in favor, not of economics, because after all, they're institutionalists, so they need to explain economics, but politics. The distinctive thing about their program is its emphasis on the political. They don't really spell out what they mean by the political, but basically it's a struggle between elites. It's a struggle between elites and the masses. It's the Lenin version of, politics, as it whom, who does what to whom and with what means and with what consequences, which is why in the Douglas North-driven program, the ultimate question is the violence question, right? So politics is in some way the taming of violence. And moving to culture is, to their mind, a kind of an open-minded, gracious acceptance that politics by itself, though politics is, as it were, is less, it becomes reflexive, politically problematic, one should grant that culture clearly makes some kind of difference. So how do you do that? Their emphasis is not on determinism, but if one's charitable, what they're trying to describe is the degree to which a religious system, because that's what they understand culture to be, how a religious system, in their phrase, hardwires things, so reduces the flexible options for a society and its elites and its actors to organize themselves, or the extent to which it actually provides meaningful alternatives, like redundant and a variety of different options for organizing the world, right? So they distinguish between Hinduism, which they see as particularly rigid. Again, it's like Christianity, which they see as flexible, Confucianism, which they also think of as flexible, hence the emphasis on Taiwan as exploring Confucian, this is how they describe this, Confucian democratic possibilities, not their language, not mine.
I need to. What is the methodology?
No, don't get that. And Islam, which is this unfortunate combination of rigidity and flexibility. And so they're trying to avoid a Samuel Huntington style clash of civilizations approach by interposing this analytic of cultural hardwiring and cultural flexibility, right? But the methods are just it's really difficult not to laugh. I mean, it's sophomoric. It's absolutely outlandish, in fact, in this paper anyway. It's utterly outlandish. It wouldn't pass muster in a first-year comparative religions course at any college anywhere in the world. It's absolutely staggering. And it's based on sources that are literally, their stuff on Islam was both interesting and kind of wild. So I thought, I'm going to check the footnotes. And it's some sociobiological colleague of theirs in Cambridge, Mass, who I think has an engineering background, who pontificates about how big God religions function in human evolution over thousands of years. And that's the reference that they're invoking. And okay, interesting ideas can come from stupid sources. There's no reason to be purist or scholarly about, necessarily scholastic about this, but that's the kind of thought it is. It's wild. It's not serious in its, obviously there are literally millennia of human efforts to try and understand the effects of religious systems on our social organization. Millennia.
But doesn't this raise questions about their other work though? I mean,
no, it's a genre. It's a genre thing. It's like that Napoleon film. It's like the Napoleon film. I kept thinking of the Oscars. I mean, this has as much relationship to actual serious thinking about large-scale social difference and change as the Oscars do to contemporary aesthetic endeavor. It's a zone. It's a highly commercial zone. It's one where people make money and get famous, but it's not where you'd actually go to see the more interesting and exploratory zones of. I'm sorry to be highbrow about this, and I hate myself, but it's for real, it's staggering.
Well, yeah, I guess it turns the lens on all of us. So, why do we find it compelling to think in these terms?
Conversely, and you and I will sit down and we'll pontificate about this topic and that. But I feel like we put scare quotes around it. I feel like it's clear that it's just the two of us trying to figure our way through the world. But this doesn't come like this, right? It comes in this ultra serious garb.
I would hope that we're demonstrating curiosity. In other words, sometimes I'm concerned that we're this paper that we're talking about, it's kind of
It's an NBER paper, apart from anything else, right? So this is like the highest level of grey publication in economics globally. So to be an NBER author and have a paper published there means it's read everywhere effectively as the precursor to a publication.
The telling part there is that it involves, if you have data sets and then that's sort of sufficient. Whether
they don't
or not
have data sets. No.
They don't even have.
No. This is not. No. What this has, and this is key to understand, and this is where Acemoglu is, comes into the picture. He is an incredibly clever economic modeler. This is why they get the attention of economists, right? Because they can translate the intuition that political events might hinge on a combination of three things, which would be elite wrangling, pressure from below, and kairos, the political historic opportunity, right? Any person writing an essay about any historical event will essentially evoke some combination of those three elements. What most of us can't do and don't do is cast that into a academically credible economic model with trade-off functions, maximization, and will then derive, assuming certain things about the preference functions, predictions from it. And that's what Acemoglu and his collaborators do. And that's what makes them separate. So what they do is they get stories from any source. It really doesn't matter what source. It could be literally the back of an envelope, somebody they chatted to in a bar, and go, it's much more like Freakonomics in that sense, and say, hey, if that's our model, if that's our idea, how would we translate this into a model? So the paper you and I are talking about has got a lot of this back of the envelope. It's not sociology of religion. It's just literally just so story speculation about how large-scale religions function. And what they say is, hey, if we modeled culture as a set with these types of combinatorial possibilities and this degree of rigidity, what would that do in a model? That's where the skill, that's where the genius comes in. So I was kind of thinking like it's the difference between sculpture and model railway set building. And what they do brilliantly is model railway sets. And that's a huge skill, and it requires incredible expertise. And they're very, very good at making those model railway sets. And at some level, both a sculpture and a model railway set are a representation of reality, right? But the stakes are obviously really different. And when I read this stuff, it's like you really do feel as though you're in a model railway diorama. And it's amazing and it's fascinating. And if you're into the modeling, it's intriguing, but it's very difficult to take it seriously as, in the way that you are when you're confronted with a powerful piece of sculpture.
Well, this is clarifying, and I would encourage people to seek out this paper, and maybe we can put it in the footnotes. And just generally, it's interesting work to encounter and think about the broader implications. But we do need to end the conversation for now. Yeah, we will be back as always next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.